Okay, just give me a moment and we'll get started. Okay, pardon me, folks. I'll be right with you, and we'll start in just one moment. My apologies for that delay. Okay, this is Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Atid and Web Yeshiva with the first of the second half of our series on the Rambam's introduction to his Mishna commentary, which we've entitled The History and Mechanics of Torah, She-Baal. I'm not going, how many, just by a show of hands in the participants panel, how many of you participated either live or through the archives? How many of you participated in the series that we had last semester? Okay, so that's most of us. If you weren't with us, that's no problem. If you'd like to get access to the archives, contact the office. The very first chat in tonight's chat box is a link to the MP3 recording of the intro to the seminar. It's just the MP3. It's not the whole interactive gig. And you can just listen if you want by way of background information. You just have to mute it. Just by way of background information. I won't go through all of that again beyond saying, of course, well, there, of course, is a picture of the Rambam or of some medieval Arabian sheikh. We're not sure exactly. We have no evidence that this iconic picture of the Rambam is actually him. My son pointed out once that it's interesting. This iconic picture of the Rambam has no peyot. You see he's lacking his peyot, and then we saw this image used for something, for some publication of religious nature, and apparently some artist or some graphic person had superimposed peyot over the image. But the Rambam, of course, the great our master Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, lives from 1130 to 1205. Most of that time in Cairo, but of course he's born in Spain. He has aspirations to get to us in Eretz Yisrael, and he writes, again, this is just a way of he writes that one of his I'm sorry, I'm putting that link to the MP3 again in the chat. If you didn't catch it at the beginning, if you logged in late, you didn't get it. So there it is. It's a link to the MP3 of the intro session to the previous section. The Rambam in his lifetime writes 3 particularly important and all-encompassing works in reverse chronological order: the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed; the Mishna Torah, his great encyclopedia; the Guide to the Perplexed, his great philosophical work; the Mishna Torah, his encyclopedia of halacha, which is, of course, not without a very, very significant philosophical component as well. And his very first work, completed around the time I think exactly when he's 30, and begun when he's still a teenager, is his comprehensive commentary on the Mishnah. Interestingly, of course, the Mishnah had been completed almost 1,000 years earlier. The Mishnah was codified almost 1,000 years before the Rambam. The Mishnah was codified around the year 200 CE, 200 after 0, according to the common reckoning. But no one had ever undertaken a commentary on the Mishnah. Now, of course, the Talmud, what we call the Gemara, is a commentary on the Mishnah, but not exactly. It's not a commentary in the conventional sense, the way that Rashi is a commentary on the Gemara, the way Rashi is a commentary on Chumash, trying to explicate the direct pshat and meaning and implications and halachic ramifications of the Mishnah qua Mishnah, as Mishnah. The Gemara is using the Mishnah as a springboard to examine the topics that are discussed there, for sure, but for many other things as well. So it's not fair to call the Gemara itself a commentary on the Mishnah in the kind of conventional sense that we use it. The Rambam is the first one to write a Mishnah by Mishnah commentary. This great Perush HaMishnayot, it's called, and in a number of places in the Perush HaMishnayot, the Rambam has these excurses, these kind of lengthy monographic essays, standalone essays that are built into most of the comments. The commentary to the Mishnah are a paragraph, sometimes just a couple of lines. In a number of places, there are these kind of lengthy asides. One of them, by way of introduction to Perek Chelek in Masechet Sanhedrin, which many of us studied together, I guess a couple of semesters ago, outlines, among other things, his famous 13 principles of faith. We discussed that, we learned that, I think 2 or 3 semesters ago. The introduction to the entire commentary on the Mishnah, the Hakdama la Perush HaMishnah, or sometimes called Hakdama la Perush HaMishnayot, there's no one unified title, is a history of, well, it's kind of the title that we've chosen for our course. It's a description of the history and the mechanics of how the Torah She-Baal Peh, how the oral law work and function and its meaning, etc., etc. Just again, by aside, of course, the Hakdama, the Perush HaMishnayot, the entire commentary was written in Arabic or in Judeo-Arabic. It was not written in Hebrew. It was translated into Hebrew already in the Rambam's lifetime, and it's been translated a number of times since. The text that we're studying from, it's also, of course, been translated into English. But we're studying it in Hebrew. The text that we're using, which also has the great benefit of being vocalized, of having vowels, is from an edition put out a couple of years ago in Tuf Shin Nun Zayin, at least this edition, in the mid-late 90s. I'm sorry, Tafshin Nun Bet. It first came out in 1992. In 1992, by Rav Yitzchak Shilat from the Yeshiva in Male Adumim. The Yeshiva in Male Adumim, has also a publishing arm, and they put out some many wonderful Sfarim. It's in Birkat. It's called, the Yeshiva itself is called Birkat Moshe. You can Google them and also find links to their book catalog. They have many wonderful books of true Jewish scholarship. Rav Shilat did a new translation of the original Arabic text with a commentary. So that's the text that we're studying from. If you look at any of the other common editions of the Hakdama L'Perush HaMishnayot, there are differences, of course, in translation. This is the end of the 4th chapter. I've said this, those of you that were with us last semester have heard me say this multiple times. The original work is one long essay. Later editions divided it up into sub-chapters, although those divisions are not always universal. Although in this edition, this is the very end of the 4th section, of the 4th chapter of the work. Until now, and if you go and look through those of you that were with us, if you look through your notes, speaking of notes, there's a notebook here. There's a feature here on the right-hand panel called Notes, which allows you to, whatever you type in that window, there's a button that says you type, and there's a button that pops that says Save. You save that on your own computer. It's private. It's your own private notebook. Only it's saved on your computer. Only you have access to it. It's a pretty good feature of the system that we use, and I recommend it. But if you were to look through your notes, you would recall that we've been discussing everything that happened from the time that Moshe goes up to the mountain and receives the Torah, through the composition of the Mishnah. Our last session together before Pesach had to do with the format of the Mishnah, on why the Mishnah was codified in the manner that it was. And we talked about what that has to say about theories of knowledge and epistemological assumptions, and how we would go about organizing a massive encyclopedic body of wisdom. That's the discussion of the Mishnah. The Rambam is now making the transition from Mishnah to Gemara, from Mishnah to Gemara. And let me just, again, by way of summary and by way of just making it perfectly clear, I'm sure it's clear to most of us, we colloquially use the term Gemara imprecisely. That volume, hold on a second, Shlomi, pass me one of those Gemaras above you. No, the Gemaras. No, down. Yes. Anyone? I have my little teacher's assistant sitting by. These volumes, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, we call these colloquially the Gemara. That's imprecise. These editions are, here you go, let me just open this up. This, of course, is not a book, but it's multiple books. Here's the first page of Brachot. Perhaps one of the most iconic images in Judaism, the standard page of the Vilna Shas. But of course, on this page, there are 4 major works and a few minor works. The first major work is the Mishna. The first major work is the Mishna, which goes up until here. I'm sorry that I don't have a ready scan, but you're all familiar with this page. And then from this point on is the commentary of the Gemara, the commentary of the Amoraim on the Mishnah. On the inside margin of the book, you have the commentary of Rashi. On the outside margin of the book, you have the commentary of the Tosfot. And then there are a number of minor works, most of which are reference tools. In the back of the book, the back of the volume, are the commentaries of the Rishonim, like the Rosh and the Rif, and in this case the Rabbeinu Yonah, in other cases the Ran, etc., the Tosefta, and other appended works to the volume. We call it the Gemara because the Gemara is the most significant component of the work. Together, its name is technically Talmud. Talmud technically refers to the combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara, but colloquially we talk about Gemara. The Mishnah is composed, again, around the year 200, and immediately a body of commentary and discussion grows up on that. Remember, the Mishnah was the codified, distilled essence of a conversation, of a multi-generational conversation. Most of it taking place in Eretz Yisrael, although not exclusively. Of course, it begins in the Midbar. It begins the day that Moshe comes down from the mountain. We're a few weeks away from Shavuot. Perhaps before Shavuot we'll talk a little bit about, again, what that was and how that worked. The explication and explanation of what the written Bible, the Torah Shebichtav, the written law, the Chumash, means becomes the proto-matter of what ultimately will be codified in the Mishnah. It was an oral law. I think I must have pointed out that the nickname, the people of the book, we're very proud of that title, the people of the book, because we are. We're the most bookish people on the planet. I read, this was a couple of years ago, it was true then, I hope it's still true now, that there are more books sold per capita in Israel than in any other country in the world. I read last week, I think it had something to do with the Kindle. I don't know if anybody else saw this. There was a very interesting article in last week's New Yorker about what the Kindle and the iPad and all of these things mean for the future of, not just the future of the publishing industry, which of course there'll be very significant ramifications for that, but what do these technologies mean for the future of reading? And it's significant. It's not just a question of when all books will be electronic books, what will we do on Shabbat? But a question of how does it affect how people read? It's a real question of the medium and the message. That's a topic of great interest to me. I'm sure you've heard me discuss this before, and we'll yet discuss it again before the end of the semester. How does the packaging of the Gemara, of this multi-generational conversation, how does the packaging of it into this book and this format affect the way we think and read and interpret and imagine what the oral law is all about? So in this discussion, in this essay in the New Yorker last week about the iPad and the Kindle and all the other notions of e-books, I think they made a point that the average American reads one book a year, which I find rather shocking. I'm sure that statistic does not hold true for this learned group that we have here tonight, but I find that just really rather shocking. Sorry, did somebody have their hand up? Was somebody trying to make a point? Esther, your hand is up, but I think it's up from before. Oh, and there it is, Alan, you're the best. Alan posted the link to the article into the chat box. Don't read it now. Now we're learning Torah, and it's good to read the New Yorker some other time. The Rambam. Now let's get down to business. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. The Rambam here is at the very end of the fourth section. Where's the best place to pick up? The Talmud, right? The moment that the Mishnah is codified, the moment that the Mishnah makes the transition, the leap from this huge amorphous oral body of wisdom and interpretation and law and halacha to a written text, and that was the accomplishment of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. We dedicated, I think, a whole discussion last semester to the personality of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and why the Rambam just had so much admiration for his work. I mean, everybody, of course, has admiration for what Rabbi was trying to do and did, but the Rambam has particular affection for him for reasons that we discussed then. And the Rambam points out the Sam Kavanato Bo Arba Dvarim, that there are 4 components to what the Gemara, here the Rambam calls Talmud, what the Talmud was doing. These were the 4 agenda points. And he's going to spend some time discussing each of them. Ha'echad. Perush HaMishnah. So on the basic level, if you peel away the layers of the onion, the Talmud, of course, is an explanation of the Mishnah. V'chol ma shenafal b'dvarim ha'mesupakim sheba b'machloket ha'perushim. And an attempt to unravel the body of machloket, the body of conflict, of difference of opinion, of trying to get both to the correct interpretation as well as the correct halakha, to determine the normative practice of what we ought to do, of how mitzvot are performed, of what one's obligations are, of how to determine who is right and who is wrong in a civil case, etc., etc., etc. Tanot kol mefarish achavero v'gilui tanat ha'emet. Ultimately, it is the search for truth. Gilui tanat ha'emet. There are 2 Tanaim. The Tanaim, the authors of the Mishnah, disagree in the Mishnah. There's hardly a Mishnah in Shas. I mean, there are plenty of them, but there are many, many more with than without. There's hardly a Mishnah in Shas without a machloket, without a difference of opinion. That's one of the unique features of the work as a legal code. I mean, who could you imagine? The founding fathers sit down to write the Constitution, and they write, everyone has a right to freedom of speech. V'yesh omrim, but you don't have a right to freedom of speech. That's not the way legal codes. That's the way we're accustomed to think of legal codes. But that's what the Mishnah is, because the Mishnah is not a legal code in the kind of conventional sense. It's a snapshot. It's an embodiment of a process and a conversation. And the preservation of those minority opinions is essential to the nature of what the Mishnah is. And again, we discussed that in the past as well. That's the first level of what the Mishnah, of what the Gemara is about, is to get at the correct interpretation of the Mishnah. V'hasheni, sakalacha kedat achat hachokim. I've kind of conflated the first and the second. This is the determination of the halacha ma'aseh. What's the normative law? Asher nafla machloket beguf hamishna o beperusha o b'motza mimenu ve'hamukash eleha. Determining what's the normative practice. V'hashlishi hatoladot asher holidu chachmei kol dor min hamishna. Begilui ha'ikarim v'hara'ayot asher lamdu mehem v'samchu aleihem hatanaim ha'midabrim b'mishna ad shnikva midivreihem ma shnikva. Ha'gzerot ha'takanot asher nitkanu me'achrei Rabbeinu HaKadosh ad elav. So part of it is also the ongoing conversation, the ongoing determination of issues. New topics will arise. New questions will arise after the Mishnah has been codified, and we need to arrive at first principles. We need to take the cases in the Mishnah, Because again, the Mishnah is largely case law. It's talking about specific cases. If you go out, if you're carrying something on Shabbat and you go into a Reshut Harabim, what's the case? If a lulav has the following blemish or defect, is it kasher or pasul? Is it ritually fit or unfit? Tfilat hashachar ad chatzot. Right? You can pray until the following time. The windows of opportunity for prayers, the deadlines for when things have to be recited. Megillah shenikrat l'mafreya. If you read the Megillah out of its proper order, what's the case? It's all case law. This is all case law. But what happens when a new case arises? When a new case arises, you have to look to standing precedent, to the Mishnah, and determine and unravel and distill the case law to principles, and then make applications. That's a lot of what the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara period, the period from the conclusion of the Mishnah to the codification of the Talmud, which takes place around the year 500. The Talmud, the Gemara, is a 300-year discussion from the Mishnah till its codification. So that kind of getting at first principles in order to make applications to future cases, that work of the distillation of the Mishnah and then further application, that's the third component of what the Gemara is trying to do. And then that, of course, becomes the source of further machloket. That's anybody that's ever learned a page of Gemara can think of examples of this. Two Amoraim, the Tana in the Mishnah says X. Maybe it's a unanimous opinion. It's not something about which there's any machloket. There's a new case in the times of the Amoraim, after the Mishnah has been completed, and we need to determine what's the halacha. So we look to the Mishnah. But the Mishnah doesn't spell out for us black on white what to do in this case. This is a new case. So the Amoraim will have a debate because they won't agree on how to distill the Mishnah to its first principle. And one will say X and one will say Y. But there's no machloket, there's no difference of opinion per se in principle. It's just a question of how do you understand the root motive of what the Mishnah is about. But in principle, they're agreeing. In how they just come up with different readings. These are the first three of the four agenda points of what the Gemara is trying to do. Then there's a fourth point. Haravi'i drashot matimot le'inyan kol perek shehizdamen sheyimatzeh drash. We call AGGADA the non-legal portions of the Gemara. The Rambam was very interested in this point because if the Mishnah doesn't read like a conventional legal text, how much more so the Gemara doesn't read like a conventional? Are there any lawyers amongst us? I mean, I don't want to embarrass you. I don't want to embarrass you, but if there are any lawyers amongst us, please raise your hands. And we will, then all tell lawyer jokes. Yes. Okay. There you go. Okay. Alan Goldenberg. We'll all tell lawyer jokes about Alan. You don't need to be a lawyer you don't need to be a lawyer to have a sense of what a legal text of what a legal text. The funniest lines that people write in the chat are, of course, only sent privately. You don't need to be a lawyer to have a sense of what a legal document reads like. The Gemara, although there are components of it that fit that kind of popular conception. Anybody that's ever watched, 15 minutes of one of these lawyer shows on TV. But there's also things in the Gemara that, to the outsider, and please don't think me blasphemous, but to the outsider it reads like Aesop's fables. Stories about animals talking, even conventional, Mishnah Shualim, fox fables, in ancient Greek, fables, the fox plays very prominently, and we have that in the Gemara. We have that in the writings of Chazal. We have that in the writings of Chazal as well. Stories about the sun and the moon having an argument. We have all of these types of things that even read, anachronistically so, like Hasidic tales. I mean, that's our anachronistic mind working. Hasidic tales are the heirs to a long body of a type of literature, a type of, I'll say it in quotation marks, a type of folklore that we have already in the Gemara. Stories about the king and the king's daughter, and etc., etc., etc. These are parts of the AGGADA. To say nothing of the components of the AGGADA, which are historical or quasi-historical. The reconstruction of historical events as if we could go back. I mean, when Chazal do it, when Chazal, will tell you a story of what was happening between two biblical characters, let's say, we need not believe that this is an actual transcript of the actual conversation that took place between those two historical characters. It could be a way of putting a voice, putting dialogue into the voice of a biblical character in order to communicate something about that character's personality or about that section of the Bible or that section of Chumash. It's a type of, that's what Midrash is. That's what Midrash is. There's a fascinating work of, it's a good example because it's just such a rich text. Although it's a bad example because it doesn't exactly fit the genre we're talking about. There's a work of pseudepigrapha, which is a kind of parallel midrashic work, a non-canonized biblical text called the Tzavaot HaShvatim, the wills of the patriarchs, that purports to be the last will and testaments of the 12 heads of the 12 sons of Jacob, the heads of each of the 12 Shvatim. And among the other things in this text are the description of by each of the sons of Yaakov as to what they were doing and what their role was in the sale of Yosef down into slavery. And it's a fascinating text because it kind of gives you a behind-the-scenes look at that story. Now, it doesn't purport to be the actual text of the last will and testaments of Reuven and Shimon and Levi, etc. And it doesn't purport to be a received tradition of what they actually said. It's Chazal's attempt to write a perush on the when not in this particular case, but any of this type of genre. It's Chazal's attempt when there'll be a narrative in the Gemara where that's telling you what David HaMelech was thinking at a particular moment, what Shlomo HaMelech was thinking at a particular moment, what Avram Avinu was thinking at a particular moment. it's an attempt by Chazal to tell you through the voice of that character what they, Chazal, are thinking. This is the realm of AGGADA. The realm of AGGADA has to be subdivided into sub-genres, but this is the realm of AGGADA, and it's a topic that was of great interest to the Rambam. We discussed it a little bit, actually, previously when we learned, many of you were with us, when we learned the introduction to Perek Chelek, that larger work that deals with the 13 principles of faith. And we'll discuss it again now, because this right now here, the fifth chapter of the intro to the Mishnah is the Rambam's home address to this topic. The Rambam actually tells us at one point that he intended on writing a systematic commentary on the AGGADA, which apparently he never did. It's possible that part of it was folded into the Moreh Nevuchim, the work of his old age, or that he set out to do it, and as often happens when a writer sits down to write, the project takes on a life of itself, and he sits down to write a commentary on the AGGADA, and what came out was the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. But this was a topic of particular interest to the Rambam. It's not surprising. It's not surprising that pardon me, I'll get back to the questions in the chat in a second. It's not surprising, it might be a question of the chicken and the egg, for the Rambam, who had a lifelong fascination with the interplay of religion and law, of philosophy and halakha, between these two components of our lives, which sometimes go in harmony, sometimes pull apart from each other. The normative, the ritual, the legal, the cut and dry, the black on white on one side, versus the philosophical, the hashkafic, the spiritual, the interpretive, the subjective. On the other side, it's not surprising that in a work on the Mishnah, he's also going to work on oral law and the Torah She-Baal altogether. It's not surprising that the Rambam will dedicate time to discussing seriously and substantively the AGGADA, the non-legal tradition within this body of work, the moralistic, the pietistic, the historical or quasi-historical, the homiletic. This is all the realm of AGGADA, what he calls here drashut. Let me just take a moment to catch my breath and look here at what's written in the chat. So Sherry, that's a good point. There are AGGADot which are, as I was describing one particular genre in the AGGADA, where Chazal are kind of channeling themselves, and there are other which are obviously meant to be either received tradition, but the received traditions about halachic matters. That's what we talked about at great length earlier. But we also have received traditions about AGGADic matters. But there are also AGGADot, which are of course historical, but real historical in nature, where they relate actual events, by eyewitness accounts, or they relate part of a received oral tradition about things that happen. So, for example, famous AGGADA in the Second Gittin about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. A series of AGGADot. Now, these are historical AGGADot. They're relating historical events. And we know that, of course, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. We know when it was destroyed. We know by whom it was destroyed. We know from our own sources. We know from external sources. These are matters of historical record, which are not, at least the major outlines are not debated by anyone. But stories, AGGADOT, that describe what was happening. So are these meant to be eyewitness testimonies, or are they meant to be some type of distillation of trying to give a flavor of what it was like? AGGADOT that describe actual historical events. The case of the Chachamim walking and seeing the fox come out of the destroyed Beit HaMikdash, and Rabbi Akiva laughs. You know this Gemara. It's a well-known piece of AGGADA. They ask him, why is he laughing? He says, so that's a story that's not written by Rabbi Akiva or by one of his contemporaries. It's a tradition which is handed down over probably a couple of generations, and its earliest recorded or written formulation is probably a period after. Is that a received tradition, or is it someone later doing some type of historical, trying to make a midrash and putting it in the person of Rabbi Akiva? So that's something about which the scholars can debate. Generally, we would think something like that is actually recording an actual event. But it's not heretical to think that it might not be an actual historical event, but a later Chacham, a later group of Chazal, writing a story and stocking the story with the character of Rabbi Akiva, because the essence of the story is still true. So, for example, George Washington and the cherry tree. That's a story that we all received with, if not with our mother's milk, then with whatever milk they were giving us in kindergarten and first grade, at least those of us that grew up in America. It's a true story. It's a true story in the sense that it encapsulates truth. And it's not a historical story. It's not a historical story. It's an apocrypha. It's what they write about in the George Washington Art Scroll biography. It's a story, and that's exactly what it was. There were biographies of Washington that appeared after he was dead, sometimes decades later. And the earliest, if you Google George Washington and the cherry tree, you'll find the whole history of that particular tale. And when it's first told, it's not a contemporary story to his life, certainly not to his childhood. It's a story which is invented to distill for the masses what George Washington was, who he was, what he was like. Right? So that's doesn't make it false. It just doesn't make it history. Sherry asks, are we to read AGGADA as always articulating the voice of Chazal? Certainly. It's certainly always articulating the voice of Chazal. The question is, are they speaking on their, whoever composes that particular piece of AGGADA, are they speaking for themselves, or are they channeling past generations, or are they passing down a tradition which goes back to whatever point? And again, this is the work of scholarship. We tend to read the sources for the Yirat Shemayim that can be profited by them, but the work of scholarship is also to ask those types of questions of when things were composed and how they were composed and what tradition they represent, etc., etc., etc. The Rambam now will go on to describe the nature and function of the AGGADA, the Inyan Harivi'i. It's interesting that he lists these 4 points, the 4 components of what the Gemara is trying to do. The 4th point, which is probably the most exceptional or extraordinary, then becomes the focus of what he's describing, and probably again for the reasons I described earlier. He points out Hadrash hanimtza b'Talmud ein ra'ui lachshov shemalato nimucha v'torato ma'ata. It is improper to assume that the Aggadic passages in the Talmud are of lesser value or of little worth compared to the halachic components of the Talmud. Elohu tachlit gdola. It is a very great purpose and moment. Lama shekalu bo min hachidot haniflaot v'chamudot habeliot. It's the receptacle of wisdom, but of a type of hidden wisdom. L'fi she'otan hadrashot im yu'an bahem iyun pnimi. If you make a deep, calculated examination of the inner meaning of the drashot, yuvan mehen ma hatov hagamur ma she'en lamala mimenu. Because if you study the wisdom of the AGGADA, if you really plumb its depth, you're going to understand the Tov Hagamur, the true purpose of a good life. The realm of philosophy that asks questions, certainly in the philosophical tradition the Rambam was working in, to ask questions of what is the purpose of life, what is the good life, what is mankind's task. These questions are in the realm of the AGGADA. And if one makes a proper study of the AGGADA, you will gain that type of wisdom. ויגלה מהן מן העניינים האלוקיים ואמיתות העניינים כל מה שלא רצו לגלותו אנשי החוכמה וכל מה שכילו בו הפילוסופים הדורות. You can gain the wisdom that philosophers have been pining away for generations. ואם תביט בו כפשוטו, תראה בו מהריחוק מן השכל מה שאין למעלה ממנו. However, admits the Rambam, sometimes if you only look at the pshat, if you only look at the black on white, if you only look at the simple interpretation of the AGGADA, if you only look at the receptacle and not the content, al tistakel b'kankan ela b'ma sheyesh bo. Don't look at the wrapper, look at what's on the inside. Because Chazal, for reasons that are sometimes difficult to understand, and he's now going to try to attempt to give an explanation for it, Chazal packaged this brand of wisdom, these categories of wisdom, in a peculiar manner, or at least peculiar to us, pardon the expression. Why did the moralistic teachings of Chazal, why did they feel it was necessary to package them in the type of teachings that we know of as the AGGADA? Why not just say what they wanted to say? Why put it in these types of parables and metaphors and all of that? That's a very tricky question. The Rambam is aware that if you only look at the simple meaning, you're going to miss the mark. And this relationship between the mashal and the nimshal, and trying to unravel the onion to get to the essence, the work that Chazal made us and make us undertake in order to get to the meaning is tricky. And the Rambam will now outline why this may have been, why Chazal wrote and spoke and thought and taught and packaged the Torah in the manner that they did. And that's the topic that we will pick up next time when we continue with our study of the Hagdama, the Perush HaMishnah. If anybody has any questions or thoughts or ideas. There are a few new people whose names I don't recognize. Alana Megerman, Karen Carter, Stuart Gottlieb. Just chat in. Let me know. Where are you? Who are you? Where are you joining us from? Stuart's in Cedarhurst. Alana's in Overland Park. Eliana Megerman. Overland Park is Kansas City. It's like the same thing as Kansas City. We have friends, Rabbi David and Julie Fine, who are here with us in Israel, who spent some time out there with you. Right, correct. There he goes, the rabbi. Okay. Thank you all. Will do.